Although their use from ships at sea was relatively limited, seaplanes demonstrated enough potential during the First World War that in the aftermath, most navies rapidly expanded their fleets and modified their larger existing ships to include launching facilities for spotting aircraft. The Regia Marina was no different in this regard. They had in fact been quite early to recognise the potential of seaplanes for reconnaissance and even bombing missions. As early as 1907, an aeronautics branch was established to oversee trials and procurement of aircraft, both heavier and lighter than air. The first Regia Marina seaplane, a Farman biplane, I think probably a Model 3 fitted with floats, was flown in November 1911, and various designs of purpose-built seaplane carriers were sketched, but then the outbreak of the Italo-Turkish War in 1912 delayed progress. Land-based aircraft were used to assist in that campaign with spotting the fall of shot during the conflict and apparently also dropped some small bombs. Then in 1912, the then Lieutenant Alessandro Guidoni proposed converting the protected cruiser Piedmont into an aircraft carrier capable of operating seaplanes and fixed-wing aircraft via a ramp. His projected reconstruction would have added a 40-metre-long inclined flight deck on the aft half of the ship, tall enough to clear the ship's funnels, and sitting on top of a hangar. The Regia Marina were, however, not interested in operating wheeled aircraft at sea, and so the idea was not pursued. Guidoni was undeterred, and his first experimentation with scouting seaplanes launched from ships took place in 1913. Brand new Curtiss and Boral seaplanes were embarked on several ships, including the armoured cruiser San Marco and the battleships Roma and Dante Alighieri. Also in 1913, they began the conversion of the obsolete 2,700-ton Regione-class protected cruiser Elba into a seaplane carrier. Elba, in fact, had a previous history with aerial spotting, having been used for trials with a tethered observation balloon in 1907, but the seaplane conversion was somewhat more lasting, and it was completed on the 4th of June. It involved installing a 98-foot platform on the fantail, an open hangar just aft of the funnels, and derricks to transfer aircraft between the ship and the sea. The hangar was fitted with canvas tarps that could be closed to protect the aircraft. Her complement consisted of 3 or 4 Curtiss flying boats, a Boral hydroplane, or a Draken balloon that could be kept on the platform aft. 3 of the seaplanes were a special version of the common Model F flying boat. It was an equal-span biplane with 45-foot span, powered by a single 100-horsepower Curtiss OXX-3 V8 engine and driving a pusher propeller. Their specifications differed from previous hull designs used on the Model F. The hull sides, which provided buoyancy, were straight instead of flared, as was then the custom in designing these aircraft. The flared hull was designed to accommodate the side-by-side seating and shoulder yoke control systems still in use by Curtiss. Because the 27-foot 10-inch long hulls of these Italian Navy boats were narrower, the occupants were seated in tandem. The slab-sided construction made it possible to plank the whole side with one sheet of 3-ply mahogany rather than strip planks. The cockpit had a fabric cover over it to protect the occupants in a heavy sea and celluloid windows so they could see out forward and to the sides. It was described in contemporary literature as being like a carriage hood. The inboard wing panels were fitted with transparent strips so that the rear passenger could see out and downwards to observe the sea, and the engine was braced against movement fore and aft by 2 wires that ran from the engine bed to the deck. It was an 1,860-pound aircraft empty, 2,600 or so at normal takeoff. Top speed was a sedate 69 miles an hour in good conditions. Ceiling was 4,500 feet, and it gave about 5.5 hours of endurance at a cruising speed of 60 miles an hour. The Boral Hydro monoplane was developed from the 1911 Moraine Boral monoplane and was powered by an 80-horsepower Gnome Lambda rotary engine, making it a touch faster and somewhat smaller than the Curtiss, but crucially it only had 1 seat and therefore it was less useful for spotting. It was, however, more compact, and thus it was used on the armoured cruiser San Marco and the battleships. The Regia Marina had 4 of them. By 1914, the Royal Navy had 2 seaplane stations, one in Venice and the other at La Spezia, with 14 Boral, Breguet, Curtiss, Albatross, Farman and Guidoni type aircraft in total. There were also 3 airship landing sites in Ferrara, Jesi and Pontedera. while in the run-up to the conflict, seaplane stations were also established in Porto Cassini, Pesaro, and Brindisi. The Italian Naval Command recognized that the relatively confined nature of the Adriatic, and to an extent the Mediterranean, meant that land-based planes would bear the bulk of the combat responsibilities during any conflict. The command envisioned using the new seaplane carrier as a semi-stationary floating base for aircraft that could locate itself somewhere to surprise its enemies. At the time, the most pressing need was for a seaplane based at Valona, where it would be used to help secure the Otranto barrage. Newly promoted Captain Alessandro Giudoni led a commission to find a suitable vessel for the project. Amongst the ones he surveyed was the steamship Quarto, then docked in Taranto. Giudoni selected the ship in his report that was submitted on the 9th of January 1915. On the 6th of February, the Regia Marina purchased the vessel to convert her into a seaplane tender. She arrived at La Spezia later that month, where work began on the 20th of February and was completed in early May. Most of her original fittings were removed, and hangars, workshops, and storage facilities were erected. Her holds were converted into storage tanks for aircraft fuel and lubricants, as well as for compartments to store aircraft components. The high length-to-beam ratio of the ship proved to be a challenge in the conversion process, since the hangars and other structures added to her decks increased her top weight and reduced her stability, already a problem because of her relatively narrow beam. As a result, several tons of ballast were added to help stabilize the vessel. After the conversion, Europa was 411 feet long and weighed more than 9,000 tons. She had 2 hangars, each of which could hold 4 aircraft. Because the floating base was big enough to do more than just crane seaplanes in and out of the sea and fix them up, equipment to service submarines, including engines to recharge their batteries, was also installed. Europa's main aircraft was initially the Machi L1, which was a copy of Austro-Hungarian Lona Model Ls. L is for Lona. The Italians had captured one of these near Porto Cassino and reverse-engineered it within a month. Like the Curtiss, it was a pusher biplane. It had a larger 53-foot wingspan, a 33-foot-long fuselage, and was considerably heavier at 2,500 pounds empty. It weighed over 3,500 pounds at full load. A 6-cylinder, water-cooled 150 horsepower ISO Francini V4 engine gave it the same maximum speed and endurance as the Curtiss. Its main advantages were its service ceiling of over 8,000 feet, which obviously increased spotting range, and the ability to carry both a machine gun for the observer and up to 440 pounds of bombs. 14 aircraft were made, and they operated from land as well as from Europa. The L1 was developed into the L2 during 1916, with a 190 horsepower ISO Franchetti V4B engine and 3-bay unequal span swept-back wings. The L2 was a bit lighter than the L1 and was much faster, with a top speed of 87 miles an hour. The L2 was then developed into the M for Machi M3, initially known as the L3. Only the unequal span biplane wings were inherited from the L2. A new and refined hull and strut-mounted tailplane were designed to change and improve the aerodynamics. Weight fell again to 3,100 pounds at normal takeoff. Speed went up slightly to 90 miles an hour, but range fell to under 250 miles. Bombs, depth charges, and 6.5mm Revelli machine guns were the usual armament, but many carried a 25mm quick-firing Revelli cannon instead, often supplemented by a twin-barreled 9mm Villaparoso submachine gun. The compromises were clearly judged worth it, as 200 M3s were made between 1917 and 1919. Machi then combined its experience reverse engineering the Lona with that gained from licensed manufacturing Newport Scouts. The result was one of the most successful flying boats of all time, the Machi M5. This combined the L's Lona-like hull and V4B engine with the graceful sesquiplane wings of the Newport 17. The resulting boat was fast at 117 miles an hour and maneuverable enough to fight land planes on almost equal terms. Early models were armed with the unreliable 6.5mm Fiat Revelli machine gun, but later aircraft substituted a pair of Vickers guns. In 1918, M5s were starting to be replaced by the Machi M7, which standardized on the more powerful V6B engine and introduced a new wing. Etna was retired almost as soon as Europa entered service, as it was judged too small to be useful. but it wasn't actually scrapped until 1923. Europa deployed regularly along the Adriatic coast during the war as the Italians, French, and British blockaded the Austro-Hungarian navy in port. Her war record and that of her aircraft was, however, quite limited as she lacked the ability to deploy those aircraft while moving at sea, and was thus limited to operating as a tender in areas where the Regia Marina lacked a fixed base. For this reason, she was judged surplus to requirements and scrapped in 1920. The at-sea elements of Italian naval aviation therefore proceeded on two tracks, as the Navy's commanders were able to reflect properly on what they wanted from aircraft at a fleet level. Etna and Europa had been relatively crude experimental vessels. Although the aircraft they carried had improved markedly, aviation technology continued to develop in the immediate post-war era, as did communications and fire control. The first priority was therefore to add proper aircraft handling facilities to conventional surface warships in order to improve their ability to spot long-range gunfire. The Regia Marina was very focused on long-range gunfire as a way to improve their chances of success in an engagement. If they could start shooting and hitting earlier, then their chances of winning the decisive battle were improved. In the days before radar and useful aircraft carriers, radio-equipped seaplanes appeared to be a good solution. The other avenue they would explore was the creation of an updated seaplane carrier, which I'll get to later. Benito Mussolini slightly disrupted this when he came to power in Italy in March 1922. As part of his supposed reforms, he created an independent air force in March 23. They oversaw development of aircraft for both the Air Force and the Navy. In 1931, pressure from the Regia Aeronautica led to Mussolini deciding to create a law that limited the size of aircraft operated by the Navy to 1.5 tons, and that would significantly impede the development of naval seaplanes. Further experiments with attaching aircraft to warships had begun in 1918 when the battleship Andrea Doria had equipment fitted to allow a Draken-type observation balloon to be raised and lowered from the quarterdeck. This was interesting, but it was limited both because the balloons were tethered and therefore could neither range ahead to find the enemy, nor spot the fall of shell from close enough range to be truly useful. They were also very vulnerable to shell splinters and incoming shells during any engagement. Fixed-wing aircraft were required, and the first Macchi M18 flying boats were duly deployed to both the Conte de Cavour and the Duilio-class battleships in 1925. A framework was installed on the root of the midship's main gun turret. In bad weather, the turret would be turned so that the aircraft was facing into the wind in order to reduce damage. Storage issues would dog Italian use of spotting airplanes during their service, and this was just the start of that. The M18 was a further development of the M7. It weighed 1,800 kilos, or 4,000 pounds in old money, and could make 116 miles an hour by way of a 250 horsepower ISO engine. Range was about 650 miles, and it could climb to 16,000 feet. Better still, it had radio to communicate back to the battleship's fire control team and allow them to correct fire. From 1926, Conte de Cavour, then Duilio, and Andrea Doria were all fitted with a traversing metal Gagnato catapult on the port side of the forecastle deck. It was a compressed air system, and its use required a stronger version of the M18 called M18AR, which had reinforced wings able to take the strain of catapult launch. Similarly refitted was the scout cruiser Taranto, which had formerly been the German cruiser Strasbourg. Transferred in 1920, her refit took longer to complete than any of the other ex-German or ex-Austro-Hungarian cruisers Italy received after the war, and she didn't return into active service until June 1925. Part of the reason for the delay was the movement of her super-firing 15cm gun amidships, but in 1926 it was moved back to clear room for a platform for a scout plane. Initially this was a Macchi M7, which was lowered into the water for launching, but in 1926 the Taranto received the same Gagnato catapult as the battleships, also fitted on the port side of the forecastle deck. Between 1928 and 29, a catapult was also tested aboard the cruiser Ancona, which had once been the German cruiser Graudenz. The Gisano class of light cruisers and the Trento heavy cruisers were the first to be designed from scratch to incorporate this system. Their catapults ran on a fixed set of guide rails pointed forward along the centre line. The trolley was powered by compressed air. Aircraft were housed in a large hangar below the forecastle and ahead of the barbette of the number 1 8-inch gun turret. Zara-class cruisers had a similar arrangement, using a catapult with a 16.2-metre stroke and storing aircraft in a 13.7-metre hangar ahead of the number 1 turret. A 4-ton cargo derrick operated by a cargo winch was used to move the aircraft out onto the deck. None of these forward positions were particularly good spots for an aircraft. In the early stages of an engagement, the aircraft blocked the field of fire from the lower gun turret. Any rounds let off from the number 2 turret would definitely damage the frail seaplane and render it useless. When it was out of its hangar, the aircraft was exposed to salt water crashing over the bows. Because of the issues with this position, a new idea was tried on the light cruisers Diaz and Cardona, which had their catapult at the aft end of the superstructure pointed to starboard. This reduced the chances of damage to the aircraft from the waves or gun blast, but it meant that the ship had to change course to launch with the wind behind it, which would be inconvenient when trying to position for a gun battle. The definitive position was realised on the Sol Bolzano-class heavy cruiser and the Montecuccoli and Abruzzi-class cruisers by installing a catapult between the two funnels. It was still a Gagnato-type system, but it could be swung out to starboard or port, making it much easier to launch the seaplane with the wind in the right place. A large cargo derrick hinged at the base of the mainmast could be used to recover both the seaplanes and the ship's boats. Officially, 3 seaplanes were carried on these cruisers, but in practice only 2 ever went to sea, stored in the hangars of the Triestes and the light cruisers. Bolzano didn't have a hangar, so one of her aircraft was stored on the catapult and the other on a special support mounted to the left of the forward funnel. In 1938, the Trentos were refitted and the seaplane hangar was repurposed as accommodation for non-commissioned officers and crew. The seaplane elevator was also removed at this point. That meant that the seaplanes were parked on the catapult, exposing them to the elements 24/7. Polar and Fume from the Zara class were also altered like this. Zara might have been, but Gorizia was not. Although the modifications were better for the crew and general operations of the ship, they increased damage to the aircraft, and that would be a tactical issue later down the line. In the early years of operation, from 1928 onwards, the embarked aircraft on the cruisers was a Piaggio P6. This had been the winner of an unusual fly-off between the P6, which was a seaplane, and the P6 bis, which was a flying boat. These were the result of a competition that started in 1923, contested by the Kant Company, Piaggio, and Aeronautica Macchi. The contestants brought a variety of flying boats and seaplanes. Giovanni Pegna led Piaggio's entry, and he developed 2 parallel projects, one a seaplane and one a flying boat. The P6, built in 1927, was the seaplane, and it featured a large central float plus 2 stabilizing floats under the wings. It was powered by a 410 horsepower Fiat A20 engine mounted in the nose in a tracked configuration. His second project, designated P6 bis and built the following year, was a small central hull single bay biplane with rigid struts and wires, powered by a 260 horsepower Iso Francini V6 engine in a pusher configuration. Both prototypes had an aluminium tail and wing structure, with the fuselage in the first and the hull in the second being made of wood. Wings were fabric covered and the floats were plywood. The planned armament was a single defensive 7.7mm Lewis gun. In the P6 it was in the rear part of the cockpit, and in the P6 bis it was positioned in a turret on the bow of the hull. In the end, the Regia Marina asked for a modified version of the P6 in 1928 with a wingspan of 44 feet, a fuselage 31.5 feet long and weighing 5,550 pounds. It could make 120 miles an hour and it had a range of 650 miles. 9 of them were ordered at a unit cost of about 200,000 British pounds each. 6 of them had folding wings and the other 3 had detachable ones, but only the folding wing versions were strong enough for catapult launch. Production numbers for the P6 and the upgraded P6 Ter version vary a bit, with some claiming that a total of 15 aircraft were built. One way or another, its performance was unexceptional and it didn't last for long in service. Development of its successor, the Kant 25, began in 1927. The Regia Marina wanted something faster and able to act as a scout and as a fighter, specifically designed to operate from the new cruisers. Kant based their design on the Kant 18 flying boat trainer, which was used for training civilian seaplane airline pilots. Fiat entered the CR20 and Macchi the M41. The Kant 25 was offered in 2 versions. The 25M with detachable wings and the Cant 25AR with the stronger folding ones that could take a catapult launch. Both sets of wings had a mix of aluminium and spruce spars. The wing box was steel, but the rest of the fuselage frame was made of wood. The 25M had the 420 horsepower A20 motor. 25AR upgraded that to a marginally stronger 440 horsepower version. Maximum speed was 152 miles an hour, and the aircraft was a fair bit smaller than the P6 at 28.5 feet long with a 34-foot span. It weighed 2,800 pounds empty and 3,700 pounds fully loaded. Range was 560 miles, and armament was now 2 machine guns fixed forwards. The Cant 25 was not particularly successful in the competition, and it actually only came in third, after the winning Macchi and the SIAI designs. Irrespective, no aircraft were bought at that stage. The process was, however, revived in 1930, more prototypes were built, and in 1931 the Navy decided to acquire a batch of Cant 25s. 32 aircraft were made, 14 Ms and 18 ARs. Most of them went to the heavy cruisers, but 2 were allocated to the cruiser Taranto, which used them for aerial spotting during the Ethiopian invasion of 1936. The Cant 25 was also assessed by the Soviets, who were loaned an aircraft for a time but then chose not to purchase it. Portugal also assessed the type, but none were delivered to them either. 17 aircraft remained in service in 1939, despite the fact that it had now been replaced by the Imam Ro 43. The 43 stemmed from a 1933 competition for a 150-mile-an-hour capable catapult-launched seaplane with 5.5 hours of endurance. Performance improvements over the Cant 25 were therefore quite modest, but the Regia Marina was really after easier handling and the ability to carry better radios and weapons. Imam assigned the project to Giovanni Galasso, their future technical director, who developed a seaplane variant of the land-based Ro 37 bis. Although the new aircraft maintained many parts from the land plane, Galasso designed a different biplane wing configuration, added a central float and elevators that could operate from the sea's surface. The fuselage had a rectangular cross-section and was made of welded steel tubes. A 700 horsepower Piaggio PXR 9-cylinder radial was attached to the front frame by way of 6 bolts. It drove a 3-meter diameter 3-bladed metal propeller. The fuel system had a capacity of 696 litres or 183 gallons, held in 3 aluminium tanks. The 2 main tanks were in the fuselage and in the main float, while the third was under the central landing gear, feeding the engine via gravity. The starting system was pneumatic, using compressed air, supplied by a Grelli compressor, which also operated the RT system generator in the event of a forced ditching. The crew compartments were open, with the pilot's seat located at the front. That seat had a windshield, and it could be protected by 2 transparent side panels that slid between the windshield and a fixed transparent rear canopy. The panels were independently adjustable in height so that either one could create a shelter, or both could completely enclose the pilot's seat. The seat was height adjustable, an unheard of luxury. There were square windows in the fuselage each side of the observer's seat so he could look down into the sides. The fuselage covering was a mix of aluminium and canvas. The wings were interesting biconvex gull-wing shapes, with the lower one being slightly shorter than the upper. They're slightly swept and canvas-covered over aluminium and spruce ribs. The main float was made of 5 plywood sections and joined to the fuselage by way of a steel structure. Avionics were comprehensive for the day. The Ro 43 had a complete radio system comprising an RA200i generator, an AR5 receiver, an RA200i transmitter, and a shortwave dipole antenna positioned between the lower wing and the fuselage. An OMI APR3 13x8 format plate camera and a film camera were carried for photo reconnaissance. 2 7.7mm machine guns were carried, one fixed forward and the other on a ring mount for the observer. Both had 500 rounds. All up, it was 31 feet long with a 38-foot wingspan. Despite all of the equipment it carried, it weighed only 3,900 pounds empty and 5,300 at maximum load. Performance was much better than the specification demanded. The Ro 43 could make 190 miles an hour, it had a ceiling of 21,000 feet, and, carefully flown, it had an endurance of 8 hours with a range of about 900 miles. This was easily enough to win the competition, although not everything about the Ro 43 was perfect. it was still quite a light aircraft, and in anything other than a completely calm sea, it tended to be a challenge to land and recover as it didn't settle well. The light construction also meant that it was regularly damaged when it was being moved around the deck and into and out of the water. Limited workshop facilities on the cruisers meant that repairs weren't easy to do out at sea. The lack of firepower from the single fixed machine gun meant that employment as a seaplane fighter to chase away enemy spotters or even torpedo bombers was unrealistic. The Regia Marina considered fitting a second gun, but this was not done, and the instructions for tactical employment focused on its use for spotting shellfall and reconnaissance. Production started in 1935 and it gradually supplanted the Cant 25. Over 200 were eventually manufactured, and about 120 were in operational service when Italy declared war. Despite its flaws, the Row 43 was a successful aircraft, and proved to be one of the more effective spotting types deployed during the Second World War. Before getting to that, I need to talk about battleships. As the design for the Littorios was finalised in the early 1930s, serious consideration was given to equipping them with 6 autogyros, launched from a platform on the quarterdeck. This was tested, but in the end a single catapult was fitted aft. The rear turret was thus raised 3.2 metres to clear the aircraft parking area and to give a better field of fire. A 5-ton telescopic crane allowed the aircraft to be lifted out of the sea. Having a large area was helpful for maintenance, although the aircraft was still exposed to the elements. During this period, the World War I era ships were also in a deep refit. The 1933 plans for the Conte de Cavour class included 2 catapults amidships in place of the main gun turret, and hangar storage space for 4 aircraft. A catapult was fitted and trials were undertaken with a Row 43. Although the launches were successful, the 2 catapults interfered with the operation of the 120mm secondary armament turrets located amidships, as well as subjecting the aircraft to considerable blast effects when those guns were fired. There was also a need to find space for more anti-aircraft armament, so the decision was taken to remove the catapults and the aircraft from the modernised Cavours. The modernised Giulios also lack handling facilities for aircraft for this reason. 20 years of preparation finally resulted in action for the Regia Marina's seaplanes on the 9th of July 1940, southeast of Cape Spartivento in the Mediterranean. At 13:15, Admiral Campione's fleet, including the battleships Cesare and Conte de Cavour, were attacked by swordfish from their carrier HMS Eagle. Evasive action and anti-aircraft fire foiled the attack, but now the Italian admiral knew that the British fleet he'd been looking for was close. His light cruisers launched 6 Row 43s, and the little seaplanes set off to find Admiral Cunningham's fleet. Shortly thereafter, a radio signal was received from one of the spotters. They had found the British only 80 miles to the northeast. Campione reversed course to seek a battle. The first salvos of the Battle of Calabria were fired at 15:20. This isn't a naval warfare channel, although that is a good idea. Suffice to say that the Italian seaplanes' part in the action didn't end with their contact report. At about 1600, Cunningham's flagship Warspite was bracketed by Cesare. Concerned that the Italians had the range, Warspite altered course. A Row 43 from the cruiser Barbiano observed this and what appeared to be a small fire. The crew assumed that the British battleship had been hit. This was radioed back, but had no time to sink in, as at that moment a 15-inch shell from Warspite ploughed into Cesare's aft funnel. This was one of the longest range gunnery hits in naval history and signalled the beginning of the end of the engagement. With the battleship damaged and her speed reduced, Campione elected to turn away and disengage, which he did successfully. During the retreat, aircraft from Eagle launched another attack, which the Row 43s appear to have made no attempt to disrupt, despite the lack of pace of the swordfish. Campione nonetheless made good use of his spotters at the Battle of Calabria, which is generally regarded as a British victory, despite really being an inconclusive skirmish in which the Royal Navy had a decisive advantage in battleships and failed to prosecute it. The same was not true at the Battle of Cape Spada in July. In that case, Admiral Casardi chose not to catapult his float planes due to rough seas, and therefore had no idea that a British force was sitting astride his route towards Leros in the Dodecanese. The cost of this lack of confidence in the Row 43's ability to operate in a difficult sea was the light cruiser Colleoni, sunk by gunfire from the cruiser Sydney and torpedoes from the destroyers Ilex and Hyperion. As a result, the Regia Marina accelerated efforts to find a replacement for the 43. In action, the seaplanes were regularly being catapulted and then heading to shore bases after their missions as the cruisers and battleships couldn't stop to crane the aircraft back aboard. This operational reality would be important in specifying the follow-on aircraft. That would take some time though, and in late November 1940 the RO-43s were required again. On the 27th, Cunningham's fleet, which had been escorting a Malta convoy, learned that Campione was at sea and moved to cut him off. Sometime around 0845, he had a pair of spotters launched to work with two Cant Z506s that had been sent from Sardinia just before 0800. At 0945 on the 27th of November, a RO-43 from the Bolzano discovered the British squadron. It was able to relay a report to Campione at 10:15, but then lost contact. At 12:07, an aircraft from Gorizia found Cunningham again. At 12:20, the Battle of Cape Spartivento began. It was a bit of a damp squib, fought from long range. Vittorio Veneto also used her float plane to spot in the latter part of the action, but it had no effect on the battleship's gunnery, which was somewhat wayward. The next time the RO-43s were involved in a fleet action was in March 1941. At 0600 on the 28th, Vittorio Veneto and Bolzano were operating near Crete, and both launched a single aircraft to look for the Royal Navy, which land-based spotting and intelligence update suggested was in the vicinity. At 0635, Veneto's aircraft spotted enemy cruisers to the southeast. As the day went on, the British cruisers found themselves first engaged with Italian cruisers and then the battleship. But the tables were decisively turned when albacores from the carrier Formidable succeeded in scoring a torpedo hit on the Veneto, reducing its speed. A follow-up strike at dusk led to the cruiser Polar also being hit and coming to a stop. The Italian seaplanes did nothing to protect their charges, even though the strikes were accompanied only by two pedestrian Fairey Fulmars for cover. One of the rows was actually shot down by the rear gunner of an attacking albacore. As a result of this situation, and to correct the obvious deficiency in air support, Mussolini ordered accelerated conversion of the liner Roma into an aircraft carrier. And in December 1940, the Reggiane Company was asked to propose how they could fulfill a requirement for a higher performance catapultable fighter. To achieve this, they modified their Re-2000 land-based fighter, itself likely an illegitimate cousin of the Severesky P-35, plans for which the company had apparently obtained through a third party in late 1937. Between the end of 1941 and the beginning of 1942, two modified RE-2000 Mark IIIs, also known as catapultables, were built. This version incorporated structural reinforcements necessary to withstand the stresses of launch, and was equipped with appropriate hooks for attaching to the catapult. Unfortunately, both aircraft were destroyed before testing could take place, one during a return to Taranto and the other while being loaded onto a ship for trials. Another aircraft was thus modified from a batch of planes ordered by Sweden. Persistent problems with the launch system delayed the realization of the project, which was also hampered by the fact that, to avoid being attacked by British submarines, the Regia Marina was not inclined to take its ships out of port to conduct tests. From May 1942, the tests therefore continued on board the Giuseppe Miraglia, which was judged to be more expendable. The first successful launch took place on the 9th of May in Taranto Harbour, with Giulio Reyna at the controls. He performed aerobatics over the fleet to the cheers of thousands of sailors watching on the decks of the ships below, who believed that they were finally protected against the Royal Navy's torpedo bombers. Sadly for them, this wasn't the case. The modified RE-2000 was known as the Occhetta, the Little Goose. It was only at the beginning of 1943 that it was made ready for use aboard the Littorios in small numbers. One was carried alongside two RO-43s. Over the course of the year, Littorio and Vittorio Veneto both received a second Re-2000, but Roma only ever seems to have sailed with one. A roughly £6,000 aircraft, the Re-2000 Cat was slower than a standard Re-2000, but much faster than the RO-43. Powered by a 1,000 horsepower engine, maximum speed was about 320 miles an hour at 18,000 feet and 240 at sea level. It had about 800 miles of range, or 4 hours or so of endurance at cruising speed. The standard early war Italian armament of two 50 caliber Breda machine guns with 300 rounds each was fitted. Small bombs or fuel tanks could be carried under wing, although this was never done, suggesting that the store's pylons couldn't take a catapult launch. 8 aircraft were built. One was lost in an accident on the 16th of April 1943 when the engine failed on a flight back to shore. It was rediscovered in 20 metres of water by a Navy minesweeper in 2012, recovered in 2013, and it's now fully restored and on display at the Italian Royal Air Force Museum. The fighters don't appear to have engaged in significant operations before Italy's surrender on September 8, 1943. One of the neatest things about the otherwise underwhelming Re-2000 was the trailer used to transport it on shore. That allowed the aircraft to be towed on a normal road. Once the dockside crane took the strain, it could be gradually rotated out of the trailer and lifted up to the deck. Simple. Having mentioned Giuseppe Maraglia, it's now time to talk a little about the only dedicated carrier that the Regia Marina put to sea during the Second World War. As early as 1919, they had started to plan the construction of a new seaplane carrier that could deploy aircraft via cranes in the traditional manner and also launch them while on the move using a catapult. A purpose-built 7,000-ton ship able to keep up with the battle fleet was included in the 1921 budget request, but as with basically everything else in said request, it wasn't funded. Fortunately for the Regia Marina, the Italian National Railway Company was also facing budgetary pressure. It had ordered 4 postal packet steamers in 1919, but was now unable to complete them. The Navy therefore acquired all 4 at a bargain price, turning 2 into submarine depot ships, 1 into the Royal Yacht, and another into a seaplane carrier. Weighing 5,400 tons and able to steam at 21 knots, this ship could keep up with the Regia Marina's 1920 battle line. Conversion started in 1923, and despite setbacks such as the top-heavy vessel capsizing at anchor, it was completed in September 1927, although not commissioned until the 23rd of June 1929. Bulges were fitted to the hull to improve stability, which had the unfortunate side effect of reducing speed to 18.5 knots. It now could not keep up with the battle line. Presiding over the ceremony of its commissioning was Countess Elena Maraglia Mazzarini, Giuseppe Maraglia's mother. Maraglia was a pretty interesting guy and a convenient link between seaplane operations in the First World War and the post-war rearmament. He was born in Romagna on the 21st of June 1883, which was the summer solstice, as later romantic telling of the story would return to. The youngest of 3 brothers in a noble family, his eldest brother Luigi would end up becoming an admiral and then going into politics. Anyway, young Giuseppe also joined the Navy, serving as a lieutenant on the rather interesting station cruiser Doggerly at the swan song of her career, and then in March 1914 training as a pilot. He was a fully fledged aviator when Italy joined the war on May 24, 1915. That day, an Austro-Hungarian seaplane tried to drop bombs on Venice, but it was chased away by machine gun fire from Maraglia's Albatross. Over the next few months, he seemingly waged a one-man war against the Austrians, repeatedly leading raids that monitored the coast and dropped bombs on coastal shipping. He also repeatedly thwarted bombing raids on Venice. Then on the 21st of December 1915, the winter solstice, he took a Machi L-1 up for a training mission over the lagoon, but something went wrong and the aircraft plummeted vertically into the water from 60 metres up during what had seemed like a relatively normal landing procedure. He survived the crash but died on board the lifeboat that pulled him out of the water. This would have simply been another loss of a young life to a finicky early aircraft if it wasn't for the status of Maraglia's family. The funeral was a lavish affair, with the young man's body borne across the lagoon in a boat swathed in black velvet and followed by dozens of others. The Venice Seaplane base was later named after him. His personal association with the poet Gabriele D'Annunzio cemented his fame as a tragic hero. The poet dedicated fully 60 pages of his 1921 epic Notturno to him and another aviator. Naming the new seaplane carrier after a man now synonymous with that type of aircraft was therefore a crowd-pleasing move. The ship itself was equipped with 2 hangars, one at the stern that could hold 6 Machi M18AR seaplanes with folded wings, and one at the bow that could accommodate 5 more of the aircraft. Including aircraft stored with their wings detached on the main deck, the ship could carry about 20 aircraft. 2 Gagnotto-type catapults were installed to launch them at sea. From 1931, it also carried the Cant 25s, ostensibly to provide fighter cover. To launch those aircraft, two large opening side doors were installed at the centre line. The hangar ceiling also had a track installed, along which a jib crane that extended 9 metres outboard was installed. A hind mat pulled along in the water behind the ship was used to recover seaplanes when the ship was underway, as an aircraft on the mat was stationary relative to the ship and could easily be craned aboard. This was removed in 1937 as the Row-43s were too fragile to be scooped up in this manner. During the 1930s, the Regia Marina upgraded its dreadnoughts, increasing the battle fleet's speed to 26 knots. Maraglia was now left far behind, and in the wake of the East African crisis in 1934, consideration was given to building a combination cruiser and seaplane carrier like the Japanese Chitose class, armed with 8-inch guns. But the industrial reality was that Italy was also overstrained building the ships it had on the slipway and on the drawing board, so attention was focused on building a proper carrier instead. Although she survived the attack on Taranto, Maraglia was unable to contribute to the war effort in any really useful way besides as a trials platform, and was largely used as a seaplane tender in Taranto harbour and a conventional freighter. She was scrapped in 1950. So how good were Italy's Second World War seaplane spotters compared to the other major powers? I'll use the Row-43 as the point of comparison as it was the main type used by the Regia Marina. At the start of the war, the British used two types, the Fairey Sea Fox and the Supermarine Walrus. The Sea Otter was introduced in 1943 to replace both. Germany had the excellent Arado AR-194. Japan had the also excellent Jake. The US used the Vought Kingfisher and the Curtiss Seagull. Only the Sea Fox entered service before the Row-43, and yet on paper the Italian aircraft was equal to the British and the US aircraft. The Arado and the Jake are in a heavier weight class with performance to match. The Row-43's big issue was its poor handling on the water and its sensitivity to chop when landing. Performance-wise, it's much of a muchness, which might come as a surprise given the post-war bias against Italian kit and combat effectiveness. In general, I believe the Regia Marina's development and use of spotting seaplanes was quite noteworthy. As in other areas of naval warfare, they were proactive in identifying and studying new trends, and developing both weapons and doctrine to employ them. To close with, it's been heartening to see proper reassessment of the Regia Marina's service during the World Wars in new books and on other channels. Hopefully this video helps in that effort as well. Thanks for watching.